Yesterday, the Young Turks offered to host a debate between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump to take place before the California primary. And I am very proud to be able to tell you today that both men have signed on for a debate, but not ours. They're going to maybe just debate without us, which is good. We still get the debate. We're just not going to be there. So it might actually happen. This is based off of an interaction that took place, as so many do in the modern era, partially on television and partially on social media. So first of all, we have Donald Trump, who is on Jimmy Kimmel's show. He's going to have Bernie soon, but he had Donald Trump last night, and they had this interaction.
He asked, Hillary Clinton backed out of an agreement to debate me in California before the June 7th primary.
Right.
Are you prepared to debate the major issues facing our largest state and the country before the California primary? Yes or no? He wants to know if you will debate him.
Yes, I am. How much is he going to pay me?
You would do it for a price? What would the price be?
Yeah, because if I debated him, we would have such high ratings, and I think I should take that money and give it to some worthy charity, okay?
So if it was done for charity, you would agree to do that?
If he paid a nice sum toward a charity, I would love to do that.
Oh, interesting. What if the network put up the money and then you guys came in?
That could happen also.
That could happen.
In fact, I've been saying that should happen anyway.
I mean, if you guys can remember, we've done numerous stories about Donald Trump's charitable givings or lack thereof. Mm-hmm. So it's funny that he even would bring up charity, considering the fact that that's been a way that people have attacked him in the past. But yeah. Why would Bernie Sanders pay you for a debate? Yeah. That doesn't make any sense. Why did his mind go there as the first response?
I think it's partially because he thinks he should get it, but it's more that he just has to keep saying he's worth something. This is another way of saying that me simply being there is worth something. Even though you're getting free publicity and all that, he's a moron. Look, he agreed to the debate. He didn't explicitly agree, I don't think, to discuss the important issues facing our largest state, though, because he has never done that up until this point. I don't think he's going to start now. But theoretically, based on Donald Trump's statement last night, he says he's down for a debate. Bernie Sanders, in response, tweeted out this, because he apparently watches Jimmy Kimmel. Game on. I look forward to debating Donald Trump in California before the June 7th primary. So they have both signed on. Now, Donald Trump saying he's going to do something means almost literally nothing, because he contradicts himself inside of the same sentence sometimes, let alone from day to day. So Jeff Weaver, who's the campaign manager for Bernie Sanders, decided to put on some pressure the next day, that is today, saying, "We are ready to debate Donald Trump. We hope you will not chicken out. I think it will be great for America to see these two candidates and the different visions they have for America going forward. What we'll have to see, Wolf, is does Donald Trump have the courage to get on the stage with Bernie Sanders? That remains to be seen."
You know, it's interesting to think of how that debate will go down, because I think anyone who's paying close attention to politics, anyone who pays attention to policy ideas, knows that Bernie Sanders is definitely better in terms of debating with ideas as opposed to rhetoric. Mm-hmm. But also keep in mind that Donald Trump is masterful in somehow manipulating audiences and manipulating people into thinking that he has a point or he has policy ideas. Mm-hmm. He twists things in this weird, perverse way, and I'm curious to see how it goes down, because Bernie Sanders is not good at hitting below the belt, okay? He's admirable in that sense, but it's also been a weak point for him in this election. You know, someone like Hillary Clinton's been really good at attacking him for things that no one should be attacking him on, right? Whether it's someone brandishing a chair, or you know, stupid things like that. I think Donald Trump would take things way further in a debate, and I worry about how Bernie would perform considering how crazy Donald Trump is. But when it comes to policy and when it comes to actual things that matter, of course Bernie Sanders would kick his ass.
I get why you say that, based on their debate performances, of which we've seen many. So you have a lot of data that's informing what you just said. But I don't think that we should worry about that. And I think the reason is that Bernie Sanders has been debating Hillary Clinton, and he's not allowed to attack her, really. Like, even when he doesn't attack her, he gets called out for misogyny and stuff like that. If he were to actually attack her, they don't allow it. They would bury him. But along the way, there have been people he's been willing to attack. He attacks Wall Street aggressively.
He does.
He says that I'm dangerous for them. I think he feels 100%, 120% free to attack Donald Trump. And he would be applauded for doing so, even by Democrats who don't support his candidacy.
Here's the one thing that I do know. I do know that Donald Trump certainly has more to attack Hillary Clinton on versus Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders has a consistent record Bernie Sanders is not caught up in any type of scandal, whether it be an email scandal or anything else. And there's just a lot less to attack him on. I mean, and by the way, right now I'm speculating on things that Donald Trump could attack him on, but it would probably be, the fact that he's a democratic socialist. Of course, Donald Trump would drop the word democratic out of the attacks. But other than that, there's really nothing else that he could attack Bernie Sanders on. Look, I want the debate to happen.
He'd call him old.
Probably, right? He would probably insult him, as Donald Trump is very, very good at doing. But look, I want the debate to happen. I think it would be so entertaining and hopefully informative for people who are on the fence, who shouldn't be on the fence. But nonetheless, I mean, they're just night and day when it comes to their debating styles, their education, their intellect. But they're similar in the fact that they're both anti-establishment. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I will say, if it does happen, and the fact that Donald Trump said he would, and then he said again today that he would, again, that is only 10% as it'll stick as if another person makes a promise. But if it does happen, I would temper my expectations. I think that Bernie Sanders will attack him. I think he'll have great lines. It'll be a vicious attack. It'll be awesome. But Donald Trump doesn't, he just evades everything because no one can keep him to his word because he has so many words, so many different conflicting words, that I think unless you attack him in a particularly low, vulgar way about his hands or something like that, you really piss him off the way they did in that one debate with Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz double teaming him, where he got all pissed off and he didn't want to talk anymore, and it was just awesome to watch. He doesn't normally do that. And so I'm more interested in what Bernie Sanders says than Donald Trump.
Of course.
In that case.
Of course.
Also, there's a very good chance that the only reason he said any of this stuff is to get publicity for, oh, look how charitable he is. He wants to give to charity. That's why he's going to do it. And why would he care about that? Because we're at the tail end of a week of news about how he didn't actually raise the money that he said he did for veterans charities. They called him out. He bitched and complained about how Hillary Clinton was to blame for saying he hadn't raised it, when multiple times at the event months ago he said, we've passed 6 million. And so in response, he was so spooked by all this bad news that he literally donated $1 million himself to cover for it. So he will give to charity if he looks bad before doing so. But we also know historically what his charitable givings are like. An analysis showed that 60 to 70% of his charity was him choosing not to develop property that he could develop that people might not want him to develop. So in many cases, he would say, oh, this is an area where developing it would block someone's view or something.
Right.
I won't do it. How charitable am I? And in many cases, he goes on to eventually develop it anyway.
No, and it was also
What a
incredible.
dickhead.
Another idea of charity was loaning out his golf courses for charitable events.
That's cool, I guess.
I mean, that's something.
That's better than the other thing.
Yes,
but it's not
I agree
money.
with you on that. Yeah, it's not like he's, on the ground feeding, poor women and children or poor people in general. Like, he hasn't done anything tangible.